the dialectical imagination is about rupture, brokenness, distance, gaps, chasms. That's the Wasteland kind of part and parcel, right? And then in Four Quartets, Eliot is interested in and explicitly says, right, these are, hints and guesses, and the gift half understood is incarnation, right? He's interested in how those moments, the moment in the rose garden, those moments of where where time seems to open up to eternity aren't just fun, lovely, beautiful moments, right? They tell us something really important about the essential nature of existence, which is there is a deep relationship, a sustaining relationship between the immanent and the transcendent.
Hey everyone, you're listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a podcast in which philosophers, theologians, and literary critics discuss how literature can help us think more deeply about love, happiness, and meaning in human life. As always, I'm your host, Jennifer Frey. I'm a philosopher at the University of South Carolina, and I'm a fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. As always, I'd like to thank my sponsors for their support of this podcast. First and foremost, the Institute for Human Ecology, which underwrites this podcast. The IHE is an academic institute committed to research into the conditions vital for human flourishing. To learn more about the IHE and all of the events and programs they put on, you can go to their website, ihe.catholic.edu. And I'd also like to thank The Lamp and The Point magazines for underwriting my Patreon page. You can go to patreon.com/eudaimoniapod to sign up to be a monthly patron. As a $10 monthly patron, for example, you can get a free digital subscription to either The Lamp or The Point magazines. The Lamp is a bi-monthly lay-edited journal of Catholic letters. To read some of their content, please go to thelampmagazine.com. And The Point is a magazine of philosophical writing. You can check out the fall issue at thepointmag.com. I am pleased to get to episode 58 of the podcast, in which I chat with Anthony Domestico, a critic and professor of literature at Purchase College, about the poetry of TS Eliot. As always, I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Sacred and Profane Love. I am recording from Ohio, where it's really snowy and it's finally somewhat quiet because my kids are gone for a few hours. And so I'm really excited to be podcasting and get a break from playing family bingo, which I've played like maybe 200 times right now, and I'm close to losing my mind. So today I'm really excited to be joined by Anthony Domestico. Anthony is an associate professor of literature at Purchase College, and he's also the book's columnist for Commonweal. Welcome to the podcast, Anthony.
Thanks so much for having me.
I think the place to start is not with the poetry, but with the man. And just kind of, obviously there's a lot that you could say there, but I'm sort of interested in, the basic narrative arc of his life.
Yeah.
And at least up until the time that he writes the Four Quartets. Yeah. So let's hear about Eliot.
Yeah, so Eliot was born into a Boston Brahmin family. Although he was not born in New England, he was born in St. Louis. And St. Louis, in many ways, in the Mississippi River specifically, are really important to all of his poetry, but especially to the Dry Salvages, one of the Four Quartets.
So I'm Midwestern, and yeah. I think of him as a Midwesterner. This is correct, right? He's Midwestern.
Yeah. I mean, he's strange, right? Because he's absolutely Midwestern in many ways. He's absolutely and deeply New England in many ways, right? He, would go for summers. The Dry Salvages refers to the place where he would summer with his family, off the coast of St. Anne. But he's also, of course, he moves to England, right, in the 19-teens, and he's quite keen on becoming English, right? So he's this strange amalgamation of Midwestern roots, deep New England heritage, and borrowed or imitated Anglicanism, right? And one of the great things whenever I teach the Wasteland, I always have my students first listen to it. And that's something I want to maybe talk about together in talking about the Wasteland and also talking about Four Quartets. How so you started off by saying, right, that you've loved Eliot, but you've never quite gotten him, right? And he has I think it's in an essay on Dante, he says that genuine poetry can communicate before it is understood, right?
Yeah.
Part of the way it communicates, of course, is in his music. He has one of the great poetic ears in the English tradition. But whenever I teach the Wasteland, I have my students listen to him reading the Wasteland and ask them, what do you make of his accent, right? Because it really is like a Midwesterner, right? Speaking kind of with New England Tony undertones, trying on an English accent at the same time. It's this really
Yeah.
strange kind of hybrid.
Yeah, but it's great. I mean, it's sort of, I mean, first of all, it's classically Midwestern.
Yeah.
Is to be deeply uncomfortable with being Midwestern
Yeah.
and like just desperately trying to like take on another culture. I mean,
Yeah.
I can say this of myself as well.
Uh-huh.
But I actually listened to Alec Guinness read The Wasteland
Uh-huh.
just for the kitsch of it. And also it was
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Also on YouTube, guys.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So he's
Well, and I think that those multiple selves and those multiple voices in particular, right, are so central to what we think of as Eliot the poet, right? That one of the features, not just of the Wasteland, of Four Quartets as well, but especially and dramatically of the Wasteland, is its many voices, right? Its many accents, its many registers. Famously, the poem was initially going to be called "He Do the Police in Different Voices."
kind of glad they changed that.
Definitely. I mean, Pound, great editor. And one of the great decisions was to not have it be "He Do the Police in Different Voices." Yeah.
Just doesn't land the same. I don't
No,
know.
it certainly does not. But so yeah, he's born in St. Louis. He spends his childhood in St. Louis. He's a pretty sickly child, spends a lot of time inside reading. And he's raised in, and I think this will be important for our later conversation, he's raised in like a soft Unitarian family, right? And this is something that he'll react against really throughout his entire career.
What's
But
a soft Unitarian? What's a hard Unitarian? Just so that I can understand the soft one by contrast.
Yeah, so in his own reflections, right, he talks about how the family didn't particularly care about doctrine or dogma, that it was more interested in, what he describes critically as something like religious romanticism, right? Religious feeling, as
Yeah.
opposed to, yeah.
That just sounds Unitarian, though.
Yeah.
I mean, that's their thing.
So I guess what I'm probably doing is maybe unconsciously taking on Eliot's own biases, right? That when he's talking about religion, when he wants to criticize something, he oftentimes describes it as soft, romantic, feelings-based. And when he wants to praise something, he talks about its rigor, its discipline.
Right.
But so he's raised in St. Louis, and his father actually is a businessman. He is the proprietor of a brick and hydraulic company. Eliot ends up going to Harvard as an undergrad. You, of course, will know and be interested that he trained to initially be a philosopher, right? He was writing a dissertation, finished a dissertation on F.H. Bradley. And when he's at Harvard as an undergrad, he really has been writing some kind of poetry, not really Eliot-like poetry, not what we would describe as Eliot-like poetry throughout his early years. But when he's at Harvard, he discovers the French poet Jules Laforgue, who is a really important poet for him in discovering his own voice. And this is something that I think is crucial to Eliot's sense of tradition, his sense of poetry, that Eliot came to find his own voice in part by kind of borrowing and using the voice of another poet, Laforgue, who was deeply ironic, deeply sardonic, wrote about modernity and wrote about unpoetic subjects. That this connects actually to another really important poet for Eliot, who I know you've spoken with Dana Joya about, Baudelaire, right? Kind of finding poetry in the sordid and the unpoetic. So when he's at Harvard, he starts writing poetry, something that looks more like Eliot's poetry. In fact, he starts writing proofrock when he's an undergrad. But he decides that he thinks he wants to be a philosopher. He is working on a dissertation. He goes to Europe, and when he's in Europe, World War I intervenes. He decides that he's not going to come back to the United States. He's not going to be a philosopher, right? He's going to be a poet.
Mm-hmm.
And
sorry, but was he studying philosophy in the UK or?
Yes. So he was
who was he? Was he at Oxford? Was he at Cambridge? Who was he studying with?
So he is a student at Harvard still, right? He's in the PhD program there, and he's taking kind of classes. He is there in the early 19 teens, so he's kind of amidst the vogue for Bergson, right? A lot of French philosophy is being talked about, and he ends up though kind of deciding not to become a philosopher, to stay in England and to clinch this decision, to basically clinch the decision not to return to the U.S. and become an academic. He marries a woman named Vivian, and it is a famously terrible marriage, really from the start.
Mm-hmm.
And
was she like aristocratic? What was her deal?
So she's not aristocratic, and that's part of what so offended his family. Besides, his mother wanted him to be a philosopher. They wanted him.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
that's uncommon.
Yeah. Well, they wanted. I mean, you'll love this, right? They wanted him to have the kind of stable professional life of the philosopher, right? That's a stable professional life, right? As opposed to the life of the poet. But so Vivian is not of a particularly high class. She's interested in the arts. She ends up writing little vignettes for the Criterion when Eliot ends up kind of editing that magazine. But she's really a bit of a mess. She is a hypochondriac. She also had serious health issues, but she's a hypochondriac. Shortly after they get married, she has an affair with Bertrand Russell. And it's just a pretty nightmarish marriage from start to finish. And it is in part out of the emotional and, it seems, sexual dysfunction and neuroticism of this marriage, partly out of the dysfunction and neuroticism of the marriage, that the Wasteland emerges, right? That the Wasteland has
how many years from the marriage to the publication? Because the Wasteland's in 1922, correct?
1922, yeah. They're married in 1915.
Okay.
And yeah, so there are horrible letters that Eliot writes, both during and especially kind of after the marriage, in which he talks about how he's had to turn himself into a machine, right? Basically, had to shut down all human feeling in order to continue living in this kind of toxic marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the Wasteland emerges out of all kinds of things: deep poetic tradition, Eliot's really careful thinking about European culture and history, but it also clearly emerges out of this long-standing kind of traumatic relationship that he had with Vivian.
So in 1922, he's not yet a Christian, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So why not just divorce his wife? Because I know later he has religious convictions. It's against canon law. But at this point, if it's so terrible and he's a pagan, why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think partly, even though Eliot had not converted by 1922, I mean, I think one disservice that we've oftentimes done to Eliot is to think that there's an absolute gap separating the early Eliot from the later Eliot. And I think that, he was raised in a Christian family, and he was interested in mysticism, for instance, when he was an undergrad at Harvard, right? He's a kind kind of complicatedly, I think, still religious poet and religious thinker, even before he converts. So maybe it's the lingering after effects, right, of a Christian upbringing that causes him or leads him to not divorce Vivian. I think maybe the more interesting thing we might say, right, is that the marriage was terrible for his life and really good for his poetry, right? That it was
Yeah, all that suffering.
it was precisely out of that kind of cauldron of neuroses and sniping and recrimination that the great poetry of the late teens and early 20s emerged.
Do you think he was self-consciously aware of that connection and was sort of like wanting to hold on to it somehow? Or this is just a third personal description of what was actually the case?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, right? Because in probably his most important piece of criticism, which he wrote, when he was working on the Wasteland, Tradition and the Individual Talent, Eliot talks about how poetry is not an expression of personality, right? It's an escape from personality, right? In Tradition and the Individual Talent, he talks about poetry as being a kind of disciplining of the self that leads to almost an extinction of the self in the poem. And so he would, I think, at least when he was writing that essay and for long stretches of his life, would have been quite resistant to the idea that he is living in a certain way so as to create a certain kind of poetry, right? Because poetry is precisely an escape in certain ways from personality, from selfhood for him. So I don't know that, especially when he was working on the Wasteland, I don't know that he would have said, I mean, I think he almost certainly wouldn't have said, I'm staying in this bad marriage because it's creating great poetry, right?
Mm.
I think it's hard not to think that was at least somewhat at play.
Mm-hmm.
In part because the really powerful and decidedly new poetry that was emerging at that time so clearly seems to emerge from the kind of pressure cooker that was that marriage.
Well, another possible explanation is that he just was socially conservative. But was he socially conservative? I know later on in his life he's socially conservative, but I wasn't sure if that was a consistent.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, he's a great satirist of the overly mannered, especially the overly mannered kind of New England society that he was very familiar with.
Mhm.
Some of his early poems, he has a great early poem, The Portrait of a Lady. He, in Proof Rock, right? Women come and go speaking or talking of Michelangelo, right? There, he's very attuned to the the artifice and manneredness of convention and of social existence. So he's able to train a satirical eye on it, and he also absolutely abides by it, right? So I think you're absolutely right to say that he probably didn't get divorced in part simply because that's not what was done, right? And he was both withering and completely complicit in kind of social convention.
Right. It's kind of like you don't want to formalize a failure. You
Yes.
don't want to formally recognize a failure.
Especially when this was such I mean, he understands it in Ezra Pound in letters actually to Eliot. Ezra Pound at the time of the marriage, right, in 1915, when Eliot has basically decided, I'm not going to go home and be a philosopher, I'm going to marry and be a poet.
Mm-hmm.
Pound kind of writes to Eliot's parents and cast this marriage in precisely those dramatic terms, right? That this marriage is an act, right? This is an act that is choosing the life of the artist, the life of the poet, the life of kind of bohemianism against the stuffy life of the academic.
Mm-hmm.
And to kind of renege on that act, I think you're right, would be not just to admit failure, but to admit failure of a decision that was made not just in a partner, but seemed to be made for a certain kind of life, right?
Yeah. So was he hanging out with like the Bloomsbury crowd? Like,
So he's from a pretty early stage. He's friendly with Woolf in particular.
Mhm.
One of the great delights, the Robert Crawford just published the second volume in his 2-volume biography of T.S. Eliot. And the second volume is called Eliot After the Wasteland. And
Mhm.
one of the great
Yeah,
delights.
I think I read your review in the Baffler.
Yeah, yeah. So one of and I talk about this in that piece. One of the great delights of that biography is Crawford quoting from Woolf's diaries
Mhm.
after she hangs out with Eliot, right? That she has wonderful and kind of oftentimes kind of catty things to say about Eliot after they hang out. So they were friends, but they also were like to gossip with and about one another. So Eliot was absolutely, enmeshed in literary culture, English literary culture in the late 19 teens and then early 1920s. He was working at Lloyd's Bank, right? He was a banker when he wrote The
Mhm.
Wasteland, but he was, friends with Ezra Pound. He was friends with Virginia Woolf.
Obviously, Bertrand Russell was in the
Russell,
mix.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But
In the mix is it's a nice way of putting it.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like at what point then? He's a banker. He's writing poetry in his spare time. He's unhappily married. He's
Yeah.
not a Christian.
Yeah.
He's working very, very closely with Ezra Pound because like The Wasteland is oddly, it's almost like an Eliot Pound collaboration because
Absolutely. Yeah.
Pound, the editing is so intense.
Yeah.
So he's hanging around with that crowd, which I don't think of as an especially Christian crowd. So
Yeah.
what happens there?
Yeah. So Barry Spur has a really good book called, I think it's called Anglo-Catholic in Religion. Came out maybe 10 or 12 years ago, that talks about Eliot's movement towards Anglo-Catholicism, his conversion in 1927. And I think that Spur makes the compelling case that, well, kind of what I was saying before, that Eliot was interested in religion broadly conceived, but Christianity specifically, for a long time before he converted. That he
Mhm.
was reading the mystics. He was, you know, when he's editing the Criterion, so the Criterion is a little magazine that the first issue in 1922 publishes the Wasteland in its entirety. So he's editing the Criterion throughout the 1920s, and
Is The
increasingly,
Wasteland self-published then? I didn't realize this.
so it's published in America as well in the Dial.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
published in England in the Criterion. So I'm going to suggest that your readers seek out another great piece that was published in the last few weeks, which is an essay by Ryan Ruby,
Yeah, I
R-U-B.
read that too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so
Dig It Up Again.
yeah,
The Poetry Foundation website, I think. Yeah, I'll
yeah,
definitely post that in the show notes. It's
yeah.
really good.
And so he talks there, and it's a great essay for many reasons. He kind of starts off by saying that there's this misconception of Eliot that has grown up, of him as the kind of high priest of high culture, right, and uninterested in low demotic art forms. He says that's totally not true. Eliot
Hmm.
loved, Charlie Chaplin and Groucho
Hmm.
Marx, and
Hmm.
actually his plays in particular, but his essays as well, were quite popular when they were published. But anyway, there was actually conversation about first publishing The Wasteland in Vanity Fair in the
Mm.
United States,
Mm.
which is an interesting comment on literary culture in the time, right? That Vanity Fair would think about publishing it. But so it's
Hmm.
published in England in the Criterion, a kind of self-publication, and in the United States in the Dial. But when he's editing the Criterion, Eliot is soliciting book reviews, right? And he has a roster of reviewers who are writing essays and kind of longer pieces. And increasingly throughout the 1920s, he's getting people to review theology, religious writing of various kinds. And in the 1920s, he in particular starts reading a lot of Jacques Maritain, right? He writes on Maritain for the TLS and for the Criterion as well. He gets really interested in debates about neo-Thomism, and partly his movement towards conversion in 1927. There was a long-standing, I think, inaccurate account of Eliot's conversion, that, The Wasteland, Proof Rock, these early poems show a man who is kind of psychically and spiritually broken, right? That they're poems of fragments, and he's desperately seeking some coherence, some order, not just to his poetry, but to his life. And that's why he converts, right, in 1927. Christianity gives him some way of making the fractured self cohere. And that's to a certain extent right. But I think it was a much more long-standing and patient journey towards Christianity, and it was one that involved not just kind of emotional or psychological assent, but also a deeply intellectual component, right? That he was reading Marathon, he was thinking about Thomism, and he was interested not just in the kind of ritual and liturgy of Christianity, although he absolutely was deeply moved by the liturgy, but he also was moving there in part because he found the Christian framework convincing, right?
So he's reading Maritain and maybe Gilson and these guys. Is he actually reading St. Thomas? Do we know?
So he claims there's again a nice indication of what a different kind of cultural landscape the Criterion was published in. There's this point in I think it was 1928, when Eliot needed to drum up interest in the Criterion. The sales had kind of been lagging. And the way that he tried to drum up interest was by stoking a controversy with his kind of friend, the critic J. Middleton Murray, over Neo-Thomism, right? So they have like an argument about what Thomism means, what reason means within the Thomistic system. And in Eliot's intervention in that conversation, he kind of poo-poos his own reading of Thomas, right? He says, I don't know Aquinas all that well. He knew.
I mean, it's a safe comment for most of us.
Yeah. So yeah, he knew Aquinas as well as any non-theologian of the time would have known Aquinas, right?
Yeah,
he knew
gotcha.
Aquinas pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. So then he becomes Anglo-Catholic. Do you think that Anglo and Anglo-Catholic is just part and parcel of the Anglophilia that he clearly has? Or is it something deeper? Like, is he just against, the Pope?
Yeah, I think it's primarily the Anglophilia, right? That
Yeah.
he's really committed to, well, the liturgy and the history and the culture out of which the church that he started attending emerged in London. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he would, yeah. It's interesting.
Oh, no, sorry.
I feel like today, people who would have become Anglo-Catholic in like the 1920s and 1930s just become Catholic because there's no longer the connection, really.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing but a very tenuous connection now between the Anglican Church and British culture.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obviously there. I mean, the Queen just died. We all saw what what crown and altar united really look like. But I mean, it
was far more substantive then, right? And that connection meant a lot for Eliot, for sure.
Right. Okay, so he publishes The Wasteland. He becomes super famous.
Yeah.
And is the fame immediate upon publication?
So Eliot there's an interesting letter around the time of The Wasteland, I think it was a little bit before, where he was talking about how to become an important poet, really you have one of two tactics. And Eliot was a very brilliant kind of literary tactician. He knew how to get his name out there. He used his criticism, including tradition in the individual talent, but other essays on the metaphysical poets and others. He used his criticism to kind of teach his readers how to read his own poetry, right? So he's very aware of the literary landscape and how he fits within it and how he might give himself a more prominent space within it. And he has this great letter where he says, basically, as a poet, you have one of two tactics. Either you can flood the market with your poetry, right? You'll really get your name out there by always publishing poetry. Or you can get your name out there by being very, very, very careful about what you publish, right? Publishing very sparingly so each book or each poem even becomes an event, right?
Mm.
And The Wasteland really was an event when it was published, in part because it was, in the first issue of the Criterion, which was publishing the most important literary figures of the time, in part because there was already a kind of critical apparatus surrounding The Wasteland, thinking about it as the poetic expression of the moment. And also just again because Eliot was quite good, and I love the Wasteland, right? And I think it became in many ways the most important poem of Anglophone modernism because of its brilliance, because of its power. But it also became the most important poem of Anglophone modernism in part because Eliot helped to make it so, right? By his friendships, by his writing.
Yeah, wasn't it really Pound who was his major hype man?
Absolutely. So Pound is, the great hype man of modernism, and
Mm-hmm.
he didn't just edit The Wasteland. I mean, the editing, again, like you were saying, is selling it short, right? He was really
Yeah.
the creator of The
Yeah.
Wasteland, but he immediately declared to anyone who would listen that this is the justification of our movement, right? This
Mm-hmm.
is what we have been working towards. And Pound, I said that Eliot was a great literary tactician. I don't know that I want to say Pound was a great tactician because he could be quite offensive in many of his proclamations, but he certainly knew how to get poems and poets talked about, right? And he
Mm-hmm.
wanted to get The Wasteland and Eliot talked about, and he certainly did.
Yeah. Maybe we can just stop here very briefly to talk
Yeah,
about The Wasteland
yeah,
before we move on. I
yeah.
mean, I'm just gonna say it, and I can horrify everyone, but I don't love this poem.
Mm,
I recognize that it's very important. I recognize that it's extremely clever. I appreciate, you know, what it's doing in some sense, but like I read it and I just feel kind of confused.
mm,
And I don't, I mean, you can listen to it. I mean, I have listened to it, read, and I mean, yeah, it doesn't move me
mm,
really. And I think that's
mhm,
just because I don't understand its meaning.
mm,
and reading a lot of criticism of it is helpful, but it doesn't somehow really change the experience for me. So maybe this is just a horrible blind spot on my part. But there's also this really interesting claim that Eliot himself makes in this essay that he wrote in 1921. What essay is this? You would know. It's an essay that he wrote right before The Wasteland comes out, but he says the poets and our civilization as it exists in the present must be difficult.
yeah.
But then in the very same essay, he says the poet must become more comprehensive, elusive, indirect in order to dislocate, if necessary, language into its meaning. I don't know what that means. Like,
Mm,
because again, when I read The Wasteland, I don't feel like I've reached some
yeah.
deeper meaning. I mean, I feel like I've read something enormously clever.
Hmm.
And once you track down all the references, you're like, yeah, that's cool.
Hmm.
But it doesn't leave me with anything more than just an appreciation for someone's talent and cleverness.
Hmm.
And in a later essay, I can't remember which one, I'm sorry, because my notes are an absolute mess. He talks about how understanding and enjoyment and poetry are two sides of the same coin.
Mm,
So he's like, you don't really enjoy a poem unless you
mhm,
understand it, and you don't really
mhm,
understand it if you don't enjoy it. So
mhm.
applying that claim to The Wasteland for me, I'm like, oh, this is bad.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I neither really enjoy it nor understand it.
Hmm.
So please help me. You are here, so please help me and my listeners who may
Yeah.
be similarly defective. in
Yeah.
the ways that I clearly am. Because I love Eliot.
Yeah.
But the Wasteland, I'm always just a bit baffled, to be
So when you
honest.
say you love Eliot, what Eliot do you love? You love Eliot of Four Quartets?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you just look at, any collected poems,
Yeah.
I pretty much am moved by all of it except the
Except for the
Wasteland,
Wasteland.
where I'm
Yeah.
like, huh,
Yeah.
yeah, that happened. And
Yeah.
that's like, and it's funny because that's the one that like I'm supposed to love. And I'm like, it just leaves me a little bit cold.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying it's bad
Yeah.
because I'm not crazy,
Yeah.
but it just doesn't move me. So please help me.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the first thing I should say is I also prefer Four Quartets, and
It's so wonderful. It's
yeah,
like, it's so wonderful.
yeah. Even though I think that, and you said a few times something like it leaves me cold, right? The Wasteland, not
Yeah.
Quartets. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that the Wasteland, I think, is to me deeply, deeply moving in moments, right? There are images and passages and lines that I think distill and articulate something perfectly about longing for connection, about kind of spiritual yearning, about yearning for precisely that order that I was talking about, Eliot's.
I mean, it's Eliot, so there are always like amazing images and great lines where you're like, that's a great line,
Yeah.
I
No,
mean,
it's great. No,
but it's so weird because it's like, you feel like it's like if you just go to the beginning of the poem, The Burial of the Dead, like it starts
yeah,
out and you're like, wow, this is great. And then all of a sudden it's just like some random German. And then he's like, oh, I was sledding and staying at
yeah,
the Archduke's. And you're like, what's happening? I don't know what's happening anymore. And I feel that way the whole time
yeah,
where it's like, you think it's going one way and it's going another way. And I realize that that's all very intentional,
yeah,
that whatever the historical fracture of the moment demanded formal fracture in the poem.
yeah.
But it's just very hard for me to, I don't know, maybe I'm just a person who longs for unity and cohesion and he's just not going to give it to me. And so I'm just going to be upset.
Yeah. No, and it's funny, right? Because you're right. You're talking about the opening of The Burial of the Dead, and April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. And a
It's beautiful.
beautiful lyrical opening steeped in, the prosody and tradition of English poetry, telling us something really important about the painfulness of rebirth, right? And then you're right, it shifts pretty rapidly into, if you don't have the notes, or even if you do have the notes, what seem to be kind of indecipherable lines. The person
Hmm.
shifts, the language shifts, the time frame shifts. But then, you get to the second stanza and you have, what are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. And we're again into this space of pure poetic brilliance,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And I think for me, what I will say is I love The Wasteland as a technical achievement, right? I can see how, and I deeply believe that it is. I mean, I think Pound is right that it is really the poetic expression of the movement, right? It is modernist poetry at its purest and most perfect. And for long stretches of the poem, I don't feel much at all, right?
Yeah. I just feel confused. I'm
Yeah.
like, you
And
know,
and and then there are stretches where I feel as deeply in the Wasteland as I do throughout Ash Wednesday or
hmm.
throughout Four Quartets. But I mean, one way of maybe talking about the difference between the Wasteland, in particular the Eliot of Four Quartets, but I think also the Eliot of, if not everything besides the Wasteland, much of
Yes.
besides the Wasteland, is So I'm gonna suggest another essay that came out on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of The Wasteland, which is Joanna Winant had an essay on modernist difficulty that came out in the Boston Review a few weeks ago. And in it, she's talking about different kinds of difficulty in modernist, not just poetry, because she's also talking about Ulysses, which was published in 1922, and
Mm-hmm.
Wittgenstein's Tractatus, which was published in 1922. And I think it's George Steiner that she is citing, who talks about, he gives like a taxonomy of different kinds of difficulty. And I forget exactly what the four kinds are, but the two kinds that stick in my mind, he talks about formal difficulty and ontological difficulty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And The Wasteland to me seems a poem that is primarily interested in formal brilliance, right?
Yeah.
In formal innovation, in formal renovation. And it's not nearly, well, it's certainly not nearly as direct, and I would argue not as sophisticated in its thinking about ontology and philosophy and theology as much of his other poetry is, right? That it really is for long stretches, a heap of brilliant, crystalline, perfect images that are roughly held in coherence with one another, as opposed to a kind of ontological or theological exploration, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, I can recognize the Wasteland's technical brilliance. I feel moved for long stretches. If I had one Eliot poem, one Eliot sequence to spend the rest of my life with, there is no way it would be The Wasteland, right?
Right.
Because it doesn't. I go to literature, I go to literature for many things, but partly I go for hedonism, right? For pleasure, and
It's not hedonism. But yes, it's pleasure. Yes.
yeah, yes. The Wasteland gives a certain kind of pleasure or certain kinds of pleasure, but it's not the kinds of pleasure I generally go to literature for, and it's not as consistent in its pleasure giving as Four Quartets is, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, I guess the problem for me, and this may just be because I'm a philosopher, I'm just always up in my head. It's how I am. But I get very frustrated if I feel like I don't understand something as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
So it's not enough that I liked this movement or this part. Like
Yeah,
I have to understand how the part relates to the whole, or I
yeah,
feel like, I'm just I just feel like I don't know how to truly appreciate this work of art if I can't
yeah,
say something about it as a whole.
yeah.
And
And
I
like that wholeness, that coherence, that order in The Wasteland is gestured towards by the fragments, right? But it's never actually made present in the poem, right? And that's, I think, a
Mhm.
real difference between The Wasteland and Four Quartets. That I think The Wasteland, precisely in its brokenness, in its fragmentation, it's kind of like virtually pointing towards a
Mhm.
wholeness that would hold them together, but it's not
Mhm.
actually in the music and in the argument making that wholeness felt right on the reader's pulse,
Yeah.
and Four Quartets is.
Yeah, so I think I read so much haphazardly in preparation for this, so it's all kind of jumbled up in my mind. But at some point, I read a bit from Virginia Woolf's diary. I guess she
Uh-huh.
was at a party
Yeah.
when he read The
Yeah.
Wasteland. I don't know if it was in its final form yet, but he read like part of it at a party and she was there. And so she heard it, right? She
Yeah.
wasn't reading it. And I do think that The Wasteland in particular, I think all poetry is better heard than
Yeah.
just read.
Yeah.
But I think for some poems, it's like more true. I
Yeah.
mean, in lots of cases, like it's impossible for us. Like we don't hear Homer
Yeah.
because we can't.
Yeah.
So we read it
Yeah.
and knowing that it's imperfect or whatever. But the Wasteland in particular, I think is just better heard. But anyway, she talks about she basically says something like, "Yeah, I have no idea what he was talking about, but it sounded great."
Yeah.
You know? And I think there's something to that. But I also think that Eliot is correct when he says that with any literary work of art, the enjoyment and the musicality of it, just
Yeah.
the pleasure of it has to be bound to your understanding of it.
Hmm.
Otherwise, it's not really being enjoyed as art in some
Hmm.
sense.
Hmm.
And or it's not being properly enjoyed, I
Yeah.
guess, is maybe what you want to say.
Yeah.
And that seems correct to me,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
That seems true. And but then when I apply that criteria to the Wasteland, I feel a little bit stuck
Yeah.
because I can appreciate the musicality of it. But then I read it and I'm like, what, this is like literally nonsense. Like
Hmm.
there are points in it where to me I'm just like I have no idea what's even happening here.
Yeah.
Like the ending. I'm like, what is that? I don't know what's happening in the ending.
Yeah. So maybe would it be okay if I read out loud?
Yes, please. It would be okay if you did anything at this point because I'm just asking for help.
Yeah. No. So I was going to read out loud because I began my piece in the Baffler with that journal entry from Wolf on listening to the Wasteland.
Oh, okay, so it was you.
Yeah, so it's, yeah, so my piece, yeah. But I think it's a wonderful and astute and I think telling response in the moment to this poem. So it was from June 1922. So this is the year that the Wasteland was published. It is finished, and he reads the poem to a group of friends, including Wolf, and she says, Eliot dined last Sunday and read his poem, meaning the Wasteland. He sang it and chanted it, rhythmed it. It has great beauty and force of phrase, symmetry and tensity. What connects it together, I'm not so sure. Then I'll skip a little bit. One was left, however, with some strong emotion. The Wasteland, it is called, and Mary Hutchinson, who has heard it more quietly, interprets it to be Tom's autobiography, a melancholy one, right? And so, in a certain way, right, I think that Woolf appreciated or first encountered the Wasteland in its best and purest form, right, as a piece of music. Eliot has this notion that he calls the auditory imagination, which I think is a great phrase for to me at least, I think makes him such a great poet. What makes him such a great poet for me is not the elusiveness. It's not the sense that the poetry emerges out of this living and dynamic and deep tradition. That's part of it. But to me, what makes Eliot such a great poet in The Wasteland and elsewhere is his auditory imagination. And Eliot describes the auditory imagination. He says it's the feeling for syllable and rhythm penetrating far below the conscious levels of thought and feeling, invigorating every word, right? And there is something working on you at the kind of unconscious level in reading The Wasteland and hearing The Wasteland. But I think oftentimes, so you were saying that you think that Eliot is right, that the pleasure that poetry offers has to do with musicality, but that's always bound up with a movement towards understanding. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the problem that I think readers of The Wasteland oftentimes run into, and I certainly run into this myself as well when I'm reading it, when I'm writing on it, when I'm teaching it, is that the movement towards understanding in The Wasteland oftentimes simply means the looking up of those illusions that I was talking about, right? Like seeing the
Mhm.
poem as a code that needs to be cracked.
Mhm.
And partly that's maybe that we're not reading The Wasteland the way it should be read, but partly that is Eliot wrote this poem as a kind of tissue of quotations, right?
Mhm.
As a series of citations that can't but provoke that kind of a response in the reader. To understand this poem, you almost have to think is to have the Norton anthology of literature and many other anthologies of literature and philosophy and religion besides you.
Yeah, sorry. So this kind of gets to one of the paradoxes of this poem for me, but also kind of like trying to compare and contrast Eliot as poet with Eliot as critic.
Yeah.
Because like in tradition and the individual talent, isn't that the essay where he goes on about how you need to understand basically the entire literary canon
Yeah.
in order to really appreciate and create good poetry?
Yeah.
That seems to be directly in tension with Ryan Ruby's main claim in Dig It Up Again, which is that, you know, it's a misunderstanding of Eliot to say
Yeah.
that he's an elitist snob
Yeah.
because he, liked ragtime and all this stuff. I mean, I think it's just true that Eliot sort of has this appreciation for high culture and low culture, but I just think it's not true that he thinks anybody could just pick up the Wasteland and appreciate it.
Yeah.
I think he thinks, I mean, he says it has to be difficult.
Yeah.
And you sort of like, I mean, it's just like very clear that you have to do the work.
Yeah.
And so that raises the question, and that kind of also makes sense of his claim that the mere enjoyment, the musicality isn't enough,
Mm-hmm.
right? That whereas like the mere enjoyment is enough for the lowbrow stuff. It just is,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And or at least I would say that it is, but I could be wrong. I could be talked out of this. But like, you have to know, you have to get all the illusions that I'm making.
Yeah.
And I'm just completely fine with this kind of snobbery. I've no problem with this.
Yeah.
So that's not the issue for me. I think the issue for me is that you spend a lot of time digging all this up, and
Yeah.
you can see like, wow, this is enormously clever,
Yeah.
but it doesn't add up to anything. Or if it does, I don't see it yet, and that's the sticking point for me. Is that like you're kind of like, well, wait, why did I do all this work?
Yeah. Again, like maybe one way of getting at that is to say again something like if the Wasteland as a great work of art moves you towards or leads you to desire to understand it more fully, right? Oftentimes it seems like, to me at least, the fullest understanding of the Wasteland would be understanding how all of the parts fit together, a kind of formal understanding of the poem, right? Here's what all of these illusions are doing, and here's how they all fit together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas one of the reasons one of the reasons that I love Four Quartets more is I think when I read Four Quartets, the kind of understanding that I'm drawn towards is absolutely a formal understanding, right? How do these different sections cohere?
Mm-hmm.
But it's also an understanding I'm drawn to try to understand, say, the point of the intersection of the timeless with time, right? I'm
Yeah.
drawn to try to understand the deep things that poem is saying about embodiment, right?
Mm-hmm.
In history, in the
Mm-hmm.
incarnation,
Mm-hmm.
in music.
Mm-hmm.
And for me at least, and this might be a failing of myself, I don't find those kinds of issues as at play and as at stake in the Wasteland as they are in Four Quartets. That
Mm-hmm.
to me it seems like the perfect understanding of the Wasteland would be a perfect understanding of its form. And the perfect understanding of Four Quartets would be an understanding of how its form embodies its thinking about sacramentality and time and eternity.
Yeah, and
Does that
I
make
am
sense?
just, yeah, it does. And I'm like hylomorphic all the way down in all
Yeah.
aspects of life. And so I just think that form and matter have to be have to
Yeah.
be essentially united. Like you
Yeah.
separate them and I get really concerned.
Yeah.
They have to be, it's got to be a unity.
Yeah.
But these are my this is more about me than anything else. But I also wonder, and then we can move on. I just also wonder, like, you look at Eliot's poetry, and The Wastelands does seem like an outlier. It's clearly Eliot, but it's also clearly an outlier.
Yeah.
And I just have to think that this is because it's really an Eliot Pound thing. You know, like how much of Pound is in this? Because I think most people who first read The Wasteland, well, this was definitely the case for me, like, don't understand that this was in some deep sense created by Pound, in the sense that, like, Eliot had this thing and then Pound, like, cuts out, like, what, half of it, more than half of it, rearranges it, I mean, like, just massive changes, which clearly Eliot signs off on, but like it's a different thing, and so much Pound in it.
Yeah. No, in right. So one of the connections between The Wasteland and Eliot's other poetry is Eliot, from Prufrock onward, was interested in the dramatic monologue, right? And kind of one of the ways in which his aesthetic of impersonality played out in his poetry is he voiced other personas, right? He tried on other personas. In The Wasteland, one could read The Wasteland, right, as a series, a dizzyingly numerous series of dramatic monologues in which all of the ligatures between them had been cut out, right? And so those dramatic monologues, oftentimes it's like one voice gives way to another voice mid-stanza or even mid-line, right? And that condensation, right? He always loved trying on other voices, but that condensation of those other voices is quite distinct from Eliot's other poetry, and almost certainly is a result, at least in part, of Pound's editing, for sure.
Yeah. And I think, so that's one thing that's really dislocating, I guess, or discombobulating about reading it, is you're like, wait, who's talking? Like, what's going on? Who's talking? Like, whose memories are these? Like, what's, you know?
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem like the voices are in dialogue with one another.
Yeah, no,
are they?
Often they are, right?
Okay.
But often it seems like a cacophony, right? It doesn't seem like a chorus, it seems like a cacophony. And again, the experience of reading The Wasteland is oftentimes, or it oftentimes seems to me, the desire to occupy the perspective from which these voices could actually be in conversation with one another, right? And I think what you're describing, right, is you, and I think me and maybe all readers of The Wasteland, have never perfectly been able to attain that perspective, right, in which these voices will actually be in conversation with one another as opposed to in a cacophony with one another. Whereas I think in Four Quartets, the voices are dancing with one another, right? They're not shouting at one another. They're in a kind of, a dance or chorus.
Yeah. I mean, I just think if the necessity of dislocation is to force language into its meaning, that's what he says.
Yeah.
If that's the standard that he's holding himself up to, I guess the question is, whether or not whether The Wasteland succeeds by Eliot's own lights. Do you think that it does?
So I think it's a great quote that you offer, and one way of thinking about it would be to say, right, so what does it dislocate into meaning, right?
Yeah, so he says the poet must become more elusive, indirect, in order to force, to dislocate, if necessary, language into its meaning.
Yeah. And so I guess one way of putting it would be something like the meaning of The Wasteland is the dislocation, right? So like does that make sense, right?
It does.
But so it's successful on those terms, right? But that's not the meaning that I generally go to poetry for, right? And I think Four Quartets offers more of the meaning I go to poetry for.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's...
The 100th anniversary of The Wasteland, we've just decided to slam The Wasteland.
Well, I'm mostly slamming myself. I'm just saying that I'm possibly saying that something is very wrong with me. I mean, it may just be that I don't like being dislocated, but I think, yeah, so maybe the problem is me. I've got many problems. So it would make sense. But I'm just being honest
Yeah.
because I feel like one of the things that happens with people generally, but maybe young people especially with poetry, is that they feel put off
Yeah.
by the fact that like they don't get it or they don't,
Yeah.
and nobody's really helping them. And I understand that. And they don't want to sound dumb.
Yeah.
Everybody's so afraid of sounding stupid,
Yeah.
but actually sounding stupid is the only way you learn anything. I'm always
Yeah.
trying to tell my students this. I'm like, you have to just sound dumb. It's fine.
Yeah.
Just say whatever you think and we'll go from there.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, that feeling of not getting it can just be extremely off-putting for people.
Yeah.
And it's clear that in this poem it's intentional. Like
Yeah.
he's wanting you to feel off-put and dislocated. And so maybe it's just being able to sit with that. And you're absolutely correct to point to the fact that there are moments in this poem that are so powerful and striking and beautiful. And I completely agree with that. My only problem, but it is a significant problem for me, is that I can't appreciate it as a whole.
Yeah.
Whereas his other poems, I feel like I can.
Yeah.
I feel like I can read the whole poem and stay with the whole poem. Whereas with the Wasteland, I feel like, yeah, I'm with it. Now I don't know what's happening. And it seems slightly
Yeah.
silly to me. Before we move on, let me just ask this question. So for our listeners,
Yeah.
like who want to go deeper into the Wasteland, what do you recommend? I mean, is there a way of reading the poem or understanding it that's maybe more unified than anything we've said so far?
So when I teach the Wasteland, what I say is, you were saying all good poetry or all poetry should be read out loud, right? I fully subscribe to that claim. And I also think that the best way of reading poetry is, of course, to reread poetry, right? So the best way to read The Wasteland, the way that I suggest my students read The Wasteland, is first listen to Eliot read it, right? Just listen to Eliot read it, then go back and read it yourself really quickly, right? Don't slow down, don't look at his notes, don't look at other notes. And those kind of provisional readings will allow the poem to activate the auditory imagination that Eliot is talking about, the way in which language and music and syllable and rhythm works on us despite or beyond our consciousness, and only then start looking up the citations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the best method for reading The Wasteland is repeatedly and in different ways, right? Sometimes just listening to the music, sometimes hunting down those sources. And then I think the late, great critic Dennis Donahue has a wonderful book called Words Alone, which is a collection of essays he wrote on Eliot. And there's an excellent essay on the early Eliot and the Wasteland in particular there that gives an account of the Wasteland that I think allows those lovers of the Eliot outside of the Wasteland to maybe see how the Wasteland is of a piece, at least of a certain kind of piece with the rest of Eliot's achievement.
Mm-hmm. And so what's his basic line? Like,
So his basic line is that Eliot is always interested in using poetry to gesture towards that which is beyond poetry, right? Using language to gesture towards that which is beyond language. And that's partly what the fracturing and fragmentation is doing in the Wasteland, right? That it's precisely because language is fragmenting that we kind of lean towards, yearn for, think about the larger poetic or metaphysical context in which those fragments could cohere and make sense, right? And that's of a piece with, for Quartets, where he's also interested in the way in which language and embodiment and time are sustained by and intersect with that which is beyond language and embodiment and time. It's just that the thinking about the relationship between those different planes of reality, that's an expression that Eliot used when he was talking about Dostoevsky. He said that when you read Dostoevsky, you always get the sense that his work is working on different planes of reality at the same time. That thinking about the relationship between language and that which is beyond language, the body and that which is beyond the body, time and eternity, that thinking is made explicit in Four Quartets. It's implicit, but it's still there in the Wasteland.
Well, if you think theologians obviously worry a lot about how we can talk about God because God seems to absolutely transcend human concepts, right? And therefore human language. And there are various approaches to this, but, Thomas's approach is that we can only speak of God, analogously in his specific sense. Now, we can readily understand why words necessarily fail when it comes to God talk. But what is that beyond words to which he's pointing us in this poem? Is it I don't know. Is there an answer to that question? I mean, is there some, because this might really help me with the poem. Is there, what is he pointing us to? Because people have so many different ways of reading this poem. It's autobiography. I don't know. Maybe that's true to a certain extent, but that can't be why it's a great poem.
Yeah.
What's it pointing us to that somehow words fail to capture?
Yeah. So, I mean, what you're talking about, right, is the difference between the analogical imagination and the dialectical imagination, right? The idea that language can get some purchase on that which is above language, or the idea that language always and inevitably fails, and we have to kind of emphasize the failure. And I mean, in the Wasteland, I think the things that the language is gesturing towards, which can never be fully embodied in language, are something like the experience of being a wounded, suffering self in the world. I don't think consistently the thing that the words are gesturing towards is God in the Wasteland, right? I think regularly that which language is brokenly, fracturedly gesturing towards in Four Quartets is God or eternity, right? Mm-hmm. Or the metaphysical which sustains the physical. I don't know that that's as consistent. I don't think that's certainly as consistently the case in the Wasteland. I think it's more a poem about the kind of endless and uncapturable suffering of what it means to be a self in the world. And for Eliot, again, that kind of brings us back to what we were talking about at the beginning, right? That this poem is kind of pressurized in many ways by the personal psychological pain that Eliot was living through at this moment, a kind of pain that we can gesture towards with language, but can never fully be captured by language.
Okay, that's really helpful. I mean, is one thing that the poem is speaking to is the kind of yearning for unity and coherence that is simply lacking. This kind of, I don't know, Augustinian restlessness that somehow, right? Because this is something I can understand.
Yeah.
That I can understand fully well.
Yeah.
Is that sort of, it's sort of like, is the nature of the suffering that you want there to be. I mean, this is the nature of Camus' suffering, for example. He wants things to make sense.
Yeah.
But it's just not ever going to make sense. He wants there to be unity. He wants there to be a story, but there's not a story.
Yeah, no, I think, so maybe two different things we could say the words, the language of the Wasteland are gesturing towards. First of all would be what I was saying before, the kind of deep woundedness, right, of existence for the self, for the soul. but
Right. I'm
also
just asking. So
no,
sorry. I'm just asking the nature of the wound.
right, no, and what I was going to say is,
Yeah.
and I think the other thing that they're gesturing towards coherence of various kinds, right? Like the
Yeah.
coherence of the poem as a whole, metaphysical coherence, historical coherence,
hmm
and part of the woundedness that Eliot is giving voice to is absolutely being locked in a horrible marriage, right?
hmm
But part of the woundedness he's giving voice to is also seeming to exist not just in a marriage but in a world that doesn't cohere, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's really helpful to me. I mean, I think that's really helpful because that would explain why the poem isn't going to cohere as a whole, right? Because
Yeah.
it wouldn't be true to reality if it did.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the notes again are kind of like foregrounding coherence, right? As a
hmm
problematic in the poem, right? Because
hmm
the notes are kind of like suggesting, but also pulling back that there might be this framework that would make sense of the poem and its various failed voicings. Yeah.
hmm Okay, so that's super helpful. Thank you. But anyway, that was really helpful, and it's probably a good transition to the four quartets
Yeah.
because that to me does seem like a unity, and so that again kind of raises the question whether or not Eliot is just a different person with a different perspective when he's writing
Hmm.
his later poems, his mature poems.
Hmm.
Where
I mean,
like he sees a unity now
yeah.
that he didn't see before. And that it's not that the wound is gone, because if you're
Yeah.
Christian, of course you believe we're totally wounded,
Yeah.
but that you see, as it were, a remedy, right?
Yeah.
There is grace, there
Yeah.
is hope,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of distilling the difference in the different feelings that the Wasteland and Four Quartets provoke in the reader. You're absolutely right that the woundedness does not go away in Four Quartets. And I think one of the kind of silly misreadings of Eliot as a religious poet is that he's this tortured, wounded, suffering young man who finds absolute and total and kind of boring comfort in religious belief, right? If you read Ash Wednesday or read Four Quartets, they are poems that are about the difficulty of belief, the difficulty of faith, the sustaining importance and beauty of those things, but also the real difficulty of them. And the woundedness now has a broader framework, about a broader context, a broader narrative in which they can be understood, right?
hmm
You know what Eliot says in Four Quartets, he talks about these moments in which, you know, the point of the intersection of the timeless with time, in which time embodiment seems to open up to that which is beyond time, to grace, to God, to beauty. But Burnt Norton ends, you know, Burnt Norton, this beautiful poem
I
that
love
has
it so much.
it's I mean, it's just a remarkable poem musically, imagistically. It has this beautiful moment that actually harkens back to a moment, I think, in many ways, in the Wasteland, in the Hyacinth Garden. In the Wasteland and the Hyacinth Garden, the speaker very briefly sees into the heart of light. There's this moment of kind of epiphanic revelatory illumination. Then in Burnt Norton, you get the empty pool being filled with light, right? This lovely moment in which time opens up to eternity. But the poem ends ridiculous the waste time stretching before and after, right? Those moments of illumination are piercing and beautiful and sustaining, and they're also temporary in the
Yeah.
poem, right?
Yeah.
But in Four Quartets, unlike in The Wasteland, there is faith that there is a narrative in which those moments of intersection are the true meaning, right?
hmm
And there is faith that there is a context in which that woundedness can be given meaning, isn't just woundedness,
hmm
right? And I mean, I find myself again not just moved in for stretches of Four Quartets, but really moved from beginning to end. I think
hmm
Four
Yeah.
Quartets is an incredible poem in its own right. When he wrote Burnt Norton is an incredible poem in its own right. When he wrote Burnt Norton, he didn't yet have the idea of the four quartets. It was just a standalone poem.
Mm-hmm.
And just as moving, if not more moving, is the end of Little Gidding, right? When the
Yeah.
fire and the rose are one. And
Yeah.
it's really, I mean, he ends by talking, voicing, quoting Julian of Norwich, right? All shall be well and all manner of things shall be well.
Mm-hmm.
And that is articulating in Julian and also in this poem, again, faith in a kind of coherence, right? Faith
Mm-hmm.
in a kind of meaningfulness that can't be seen from within time, right? Or if it can be seen from within time, it can only be glimpsed from within time. But there's a
Mm-hmm.
faith that that kind of meaningfulness, that pattern, that story is there,
Mm-hmm.
right? The fire and the rose will be one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that belief, the Wasteland talks about or dramatizes a yearning for coherence that never actually quite coheres, right? It
Mm-hmm.
never actually quite enters into the poem.
Mm-hmm.
In Four Quartets, has that same desire, but also the faith that such coherence is to come.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that seems right. And I think that I think that the contrast between them is so striking.
Yeah.
And I think because, well, I mean, obviously, Four Quartets is about what it means to be a creature, right? What it means to be a wayfarer in
Yeah.
time, and how to
Yeah.
make sense of oneself in time in light of the incarnation, right?
Yeah.
Because there's like before and after, right?
Yeah.
That and but it's also just it's such a beautiful poem. I mean,
Yeah.
it's four poems, right? But
Yeah.
I, read them together and it really is so moving
Yeah.
and full of beautiful images that don't seem as fragmented, right?
Yeah. In part because it's a poem in four parts, and each poem is in five parts, and each of those five parts can be resonates with the other part in the other four poems, right? So like each of the fifth part in each of the four quartets has to do with language, right? Has to do
Hmm.
with language gesturing towards that which is beyond language.
Hmm.
And so there's a way that the poem, I think, quite intentionally and clearly formally coheres, right, in
Hmm.
four quartets in a way that the Wasteland doesn't or is kind of uninterested in cohering.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah.
It's not striving to cohere.
The interesting thing is as well is thinking about why quartets, right? Why he
Yeah.
has
Hmm.
the kind of language of music. And as I mentioned, Eliot is he talks about the auditory imagination as being maybe the most important skill for a poet to have. He's someone who's deeply interested in the music of language. He's someone who liked different kinds of music, right? He loved
Hmm.
classical music, but again, to go back to the Ryan Ruby essay, he loved popular music, he loved
Hmm.
jazz, he loved ragtime. But I think that the longer, expansive, iterative form of four quartets, right, allows Eliot to introduce motifs, right, to use the language of music, that are then returned to and amplified and resonate in different ways across the poem. And they do it in a far more kind of orderly and ordered fashion than the Wasteland, right? The
Hmm.
Four Quartets reads he sounds like a beautiful piece of music.
Hmm.
The Wasteland, whatever it sounds like, does not sound like a beautiful, coherent piece of it sounds beautiful in snatches, right?
Yeah.
There's something about the deep harmony of the ideas, the claims made in four quartets that absolutely is kind of embodied and coded in the form as well.
Can we just go back really briefly to the
Yeah.
contrast that you drew earlier between the dialectical and the analogical?
Yeah.
Because you wrote an essay about this that I read
Yeah.
called The Twice Broken World. in which you talk about Barth's influence on Eliot, which kind of goes back to your opening vignette,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
how you got into all this in the first place.
yeah,
I'm selfishly interested in this question
yeah,
just from a theological perspective. And obviously I'm with the Thomists on this, but I just wondered if you could talk about where you think this distinction is meaningful to understanding the four quartets.
yeah, yeah. So just to take a step back, so I'm getting that language or those terms, the analogical and dialectical imagination, from David Tracy, right, who sketches, right, the difference. I mentioned this before, the analogical imagination, imagining that or positing. Okay, David Tracy, right, talking about two different styles of theological thinking and writing, right? One, the analogical imagination, which is associated with Catholicism, Thomism, which asserts that there is a consistent and deep connection between creator and creation. Right? It's a kind of sacramental imagination. And then the dialectical imagination, which is far more often associated with Protestant theology, which asserts that there is an absolute, to use kind of Barth's language, an absolute gap between creator and creation, right?
Can I stop you right there? Because
Yeah,
one thing that kind of bothers me about this way of setting it up
yeah,
is that for Thomas, there is, of course, an absolute break between
yes,
creator and creation because God's essence is his existence.
yeah,
And that's why God's not just another thing. That's why
yeah,
God is, in some ontologically deep sense, absolutely transcendent and other,
yeah,
right? For it's the mark of a creature of any kind. It's the mark of being created
hmm,
that your essence is distinct from your existence.
yeah,
So that somehow, that note of absolute transcendence, which is absolutely there in Thomas, and I think essential to understanding his account of analogy,
yeah,
right? The reasons why our words will always fail in some
yeah,
sense, always break apart. That note of absolute transcendence, is essential to his account of a creation
yeah,
and our absolute dependence on God, right?
yeah,
Who not only gives us our existence, but sustains us in our existence. So there was something about the setup that kind of like irritated me a little bit. It was like this grain of sand.
hmm,
Because there's some sense in which the distinction can't be between transcendence and eminence,
yeah,
because like there's somehow both
yeah,
in the Thomist worldview.
yeah, yeah.
But
So I'm with the Thomas as well,
yeah, okay,
and
good.
yeah,
All
and I
right
think
thinking people are.
yeah, yeah. And you know what? One of the things that Tracy's doing, in that essay, I'm obviously reducing a very complicated argument that Tracy is making. And Tracy is interested in sketching out these two admittedly reductive ways of thinking about theology, right? Does one emphasize more the deep connection, or does one emphasize more the abyssal gap separating them? But he says all good theology, and I'm certain Tracy would include Aquinas in this, right, is both analogical and dialectical, right?
Okay,
It's
yeah,
that's
good.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, but now, even though I just said that is a reductive
Hmm.
account of theology, I'm going to use that reductive account to kind of think
Go
about Eliot.
ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So the way I understand, or one of the ways one could understand the difference between the Wasteland and Four Quartets, is to say that the Wasteland is a poem, a deeply dialectical poem, right? That it, insofar as it has a sense for that which exceeds language, right? God, right? Transcendence. The stuff of the poem, the fragments of the poem, seems absolutely at an absolute and irreconcilable distance from that which is above, right? From the
Hmm.
transcendent,
Hmm.
right? So the dialectical imagination is about rupture, brokenness, distance, gaps, chasms. That's the Wasteland kind of part and parcel, right? And then in Four Quartets, Eliot is interested in and explicitly says, right, these are hints and guesses, and the gift half understood is incarnation, right? He's interested in how those moments, the moment in the rose garden, those moments of where where time seems to open up to eternity aren't just fun, lovely, beautiful moments, right? They tell us something really important about the essential nature of existence, which is there is a deep relationship, a sustaining relationship between the immanent and the transcendent, right? So by that reading, Four Quartets in its explicit articulation is an analogical poem. It's asserting that there is a deep connection between creator and creation. Now, what I was interested in doing, what I am interested in when I'm reading Four Quartets is, the way I put it is, I think Four Quartets wants to be an analogical poem, and in many ways is an analogical poem, but Eliot is continually drawn back towards the feeling of absolute distance and difference from that which is above and sustains us, right? That so much of the poem dwells in the ridiculous waste time spreading before and after those moments of where we feel the analogy of being, right? Where we can sense the analogy of being. That Four Quartets, in other words, is a great theological poem because it is both interested in the deep connection between the immanent and the transcendent, and it's also aware, to go back to what we were saying before, of the continual woundedness of feeling that the transcendent is not just distant, but kind of irrecoverably distant.
Right, except for the incarnation, right?
Yes.
I mean, because that's where, Christology is where all of this gets impossibly complicated, right? Because there's a God-man.
Yeah. And so the poem maybe probably should be described as dialectical, were it not for the fact that all those moments are hints and guesses of the incarnation, which this poem asserts is the event, right? The event that makes that makes sense of of one's temporal existence.
Do you think that it's wrong or misleading to say that the Four Quartets is about the incarnation? Is that too reductive?
No, it's funny because that piece that we mentioned before that I wrote for the Baffler, I was writing on this new biography by Robert Crawford, and he's a very good biographer, and he's oftentimes a very good critic. He's a very good poet himself, and in talking about Four Quartets, he does not use the word incarnation a single time. And
that's silly.
I think that it is, I don't know what to say. It is a poem about the incarnation, right? It explicitly says that it's a poem about the incarnation. From beginning to end, it is a poem about the incarnation. And it's not just a poem about the incarnation, as in it's not, it's not religious apologetics or theology masquerading as poetry, but it is about the incarnation, and it says as much, and its form suggests as much.
It kind of seems to me that the first three poems, and it kind of seems, sorry, let me start over with that sentence. It kind of seems to me that the fourth poem, as it were, swallows up the first three in a weird way, and is kind of like about all of them, or somehow like the fourth poem is the unifying one, this little getting. Okay, so maybe because we can't talk about all four, so maybe we could just focus on that fourth one as a way of cheating. So that you can bring the other ones in. Why is it called? Why does it have the title that it has, and what do you think is the main significance of the fourth and final poem? If we could just leave, whatever your thoughts are on the fourth. The fourth of the Four Quartets.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because Burnt Norton, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but Burnt Norton is a place that has a very specific meaning in Eliot's biography. I mentioned before, the Dry Cell of Ages has a very important place in Eliot's biography. East Coker is where his family the Eliots were from. Little Gidding does not have a specific biographical resonance, right? It's an important space in the religious because of Herbert literary history of Anglicanism, of English religion, but it doesn't have a specific biographical resonance for Eliot. And I think that's one way in which Little Gidding seems to kind of offer the most distanced and synthesizing perspective, right? That it kind of takes a step back in many ways from Eliot's own biography, from Eliot's own kind of geography. And I mean, Little Gidding, I just think it I mean, what to say about Little Gidding? I think it's the most beautiful thing Eliot ever wrote. I think it's one of the most beautiful things that any poet has written in English, certainly in the 20th century. And it has this incredible section where Eliot encounters, or a speaker who seems to resemble Eliot encounters a compound ghost, this another one of those kind of third figures walking beside you as we got in the Wasteland. And this compound ghost is an amalgamation of many of the poets that Eliot had read and loved throughout his life. Yeats is certainly present here. And he has a conversation with the ghost, who basically he's a ghost, so he's old, right? And even by ghostly standards, he's elderly, right? And he says, right, I don't really have wisdom to offer you, right? All I have to offer you is the lesson really of the entire four quartets, and especially of Little Gidding, which is the lesson of humility.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I mean, the compound ghost is interesting because Eliot's poetry has been filled with prematurely old figures from the beginning, right? Eliot writes Prufrock when he's in college, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he's like a prematurely old college student who's like inhabiting this persona of a prematurely old man. Gerontion is a poem about kind of decadence and feeling old before one's time, feeling enervated. And the compound ghost is the final and I think most powerful figure of, or instantiation of this kind of figure. And one of the ways in which Little Gidding ties up not just the first three quartets, but all of Eliot's poetry is precisely the only lesson he has to offer him is the lesson of humility. Humility as a spiritual discipline and humility as a poetic discipline. And it's a lovely moment, and it leads to the last movement in the last of the four quartets, where Eliot, again, just as in the Wasteland, is quoting, right? He's channeling another figure. Here it's Julian of Norwich. And one of the ways in which Little Gidding, in the final movement of Little Gidding, kind of sums up and synthesizes the three movements that came before it is precisely by moving to a kind of providential perspective, right? All manner of thing shall be well, right? And it's, an attempt to imagine or believe in that which transcends time, which holds.
Beatitude?
Yes.
I mean, I always thought it was about beatitude.
Yeah.
And that makes sense of why it's not any particular place, because it's home for all of us.
Yeah.
It's where we belong.
Yeah.
It's because that final, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. That's beatitude, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's beyond place and beyond time, but it also contains within it all place and all time, right?
Yeah.
And in that way, it's the perfect, culmination for this, I would say, close to perfect poem.
Yeah, because in beatitude, you don't need hope anymore. And you don't even know faith. It's only love.
Yeah.
Complete simplicity, I think is the way he puts it. But I mean, that would be correct.
Yeah.
So I think it's I mean, I think it's an incredibly beautiful Christian poem. Maybe the best Christian poem of the 20th century. I don't know what would compete with it. Do you?
Yeah. No, and that final stanza where again he's explicitly voicing Julian of Norwich, but is also very clearly channeling Dante, right? The fire and the rose are one, the celestial rose. It's the most Dante-esque
Hmm.
poem of the
Yeah.
20th century.
Yeah.
And Eliot had a lifelong loving relationship with Dante, all the way back in the Wasteland, right? He's looking at the London.
It's a good lover to have.
Yeah, it certainly is. And that last stanza, is as close as anyone has gotten to Dante, I think.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. I really
Yeah.
just, it's this has been really helpful to me. I think my impression is that there are people who love the Wasteland and there are people who love the four quartets, and they
Yeah.
don't tend to be the same people. I would really like to appreciate them both.
Yeah.
And I do feel like now I have a better appreciation of the Wasteland. So thank you for that. We have to end this because it's just gotten insanely out of control in the most beautiful way that conversations sometimes get out of control. But I just want to leave the last thought for you. I mean, final thoughts about Eliot for our listeners?
Yeah, I think you're right to say that Eliot lovers tend to either love the Wasteland or love four quartets. And I don't know. I think that the poems resemble one another more than they're oftentimes given credit for. That Four Quartets is in its own way just as difficult as the Wasteland. It's just a different kind of difficulty. Again, to go back to that George Steiner, it's a kind of ontological difficulty in addition to a formal difficulty, whereas in the Wasteland, I think it's primarily a formal difficulty. But one of the things that makes Eliot the great poet that he is that he can offer different kinds of difficulties and different kinds of beauties to different kinds of readers. And, as long as poems will be read, we'll be reading and wrestling with and feeling we're inadequate to, but still in love with Eliot's poetry.
All right, that's perfect. Thank you so much for coming on, Tony. This was really great.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
You have been listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a philosophy, theology, and literature podcast that is generously underwritten by the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America and produced by Catholics for Hire, a group of young Catholic digital content freelancers. Special thanks, as always, goes to Will Dethridge, Bea Quasi, and Joe Coleman for their work in editing and producing this podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider supporting us by giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. You can also support the podcast by becoming a monthly patron at patreon.com/eudaimoniapod. Patrons enjoy many benefits, like tote bags and coffee mugs with exclusive artwork, and free digital subscriptions to either The Lamp or The Point magazines. For our next episode, I will be joined by Randy Boyagoda to talk about his new novel, Dante's Indiana. Until then, friends, be well and keep reading.